Welcome to the New Union Frontier, La Nouvelle Frontière Syndicale, a podcast that brings you the latest news from CIU, the Customs and Immigration Union, from victories to challenges and everything in between. I'm Amanda, and this podcast was made for you, our members, to keep you informed, engaged, and empowered. And if you're not a member, don't worry, we'll be happy to have you along for the ride. Nous sommes là pour veiller à ce que vous restiez en contact avec votre syndicat et que vous sachiez ce qui se passe à chaque étape. C'est un plaisir de vous avoir avec nous. Now let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the New Union Frontier. Today we're talking about weaponizing the duty to accommodate process, and with me I have James Prowse, Labour Relations Officer at CIU and subject matter expert, Chris Schuurman, Labour Relations Officer and previous branch president of the Niagara Falls region, and John Bay, our human rights rep based out of Akwesasne.
Hi, Amanda.
Hello.
Hey, Amanda.
Would you like to say a little bit about yourself? We can start with James.
Sure. I'm a labor relations officer with the Customs and Immigration Union, your coworker, and I've been with the CIU for almost 4 years. Prior to that, I worked in human resources with the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
Yourself, John? How would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name's John Bay. I'm the National Human Rights Rep for CIU. I've been employed with the CBSA for 15 years, and I've been involved with the union for about 12 to 13, on and off. I became the National Human Rights Rep back in February when my predecessor retired.
Awesome. Glad to have you with us. And yourself, Chris.
Yeah, so as you introduced me, I am a Labor Relations Officer at CIU National Office. My portfolio is Manitoba west to Vancouver Island. Previously, I was a BSO working out of Niagara. I was the branch president of the local union for about 4 years. I was previously a steelworker as well, active in the Steelworkers Union. So
I did not know that. Interesting. Big breadth of knowledge we have here at the table today. To get started, we can start from the very top. James, what is the duty to accommodate, and what does that really mean?
So the duty to accommodate arises in the human rights ground of law. It is an employer obligation to ensure that if there are barriers to the participation in the workplace, that the employer has an obligation to remove those for people who identify as or are protected by a human rights ground. In the employment context, the major decision that really expanded the duty to accommodate was the Mioran decision in 1999. And it really provides the groundwork to afford equitable status for people with disabilities in the workplace. It is an obligation on the employer to ensure that the workplace does not have any discriminatory policies, barriers, both physical and in other ways that impact negatively upon people who have disabilities. Or in the duty to accommodate, it can be much broader. It could be religious status. It could be family status. But today's context, why we're here talking today, mostly has to do with disabilities and ways to accommodate in the workplace.
And what about RJO, or reasonable job offer? What does that mean?
So in July of this year, the employer shared with us their policy of which they've called the reasonable job offer. They've identified border services officers, BSOs, who have been accommodated in their position for 24 months on a temporary accommodation or permanent accommodation, some dating back over 10 years, that they've either never been tooled or armed or are able to exercise use of force. So we call that a CDT, Control and Defensive Tactics certification. So if these BSOs are no longer able to carry their tools, their defensive equipment, or exercise use of force through CDT, the CBSA has told us that they intend to remove these BSOs from their positions through this process they call the reasonable job offer, and potentially place them in other positions, not necessarily guaranteeing them any salary protection or a position at level, and it could also come with demotion or relocation, medical retirement, or termination for incapacity. So in our view, this reasonable job offer policy, it does not in any way bear a resemblance to the duty to accommodate and is discriminatory on its face.
And John, how would you say that that's affecting the members of CIU?
I would say it's affecting the members very negatively. It's creating an atmosphere where members are starting to withhold that information and harboring those injuries, which in turn can increase the injury to them. They're less likely to come forward with anything mental health related. They're less likely to come forward with any on-the-job injuries because of the simple fact that the DTAs aren't being looked at properly, and for fear of losing their tools and, in a sense, losing their job. That's the fear.
Not even just in a physical sense, but like the mental sense, the social
mental
sense.
State, and the employer has no sympathy, no empathy. You're replaceable. Next, it's ridiculous what they're doing.
It's got to be hard to navigate and trying to
Absolutely.
balance both.
Absolutely, when there's no uniform statements coming across and they're all mixed signals from our employer. Yeah, it's not good for members.
And this question I'll direct towards Chris and John, as you guys are both officers or used to be officers. The arming initiative is something somewhat new. The officers weren't always tooled. What was that initiative like, and what does it mean as a member to be a tooled officer?
When I first started, it was untooled, not the complete kit that it is now. You didn't have a duty firearm. You had a baton, you had OC spray, and handcuffs. So I worked for the first year without a sidearm, duty firearm. And the anticipation, waiting for my turn to go next, knowing some of my colleagues had already completed their training and received their duty firearm. And then a year into my job, a year into my career with CBSA, I went for training and qualified, passed, and since then carried a firearm ever since. The past 14 years. It changed the requirements because the job safety. It was a safety issue that required us to have our firearms. The job of the BSO, I remember doing secondaries and seizing handguns and whatnot without my sidearm. So we were doing the job without all of our tools.
Yeah, when I started, I can remember coming to the workplace. I also, I only did 9 weeks at Rigaud. So firearm training wasn't part of Rigaud at that point in time. And I can remember coming to the workplace and there were maybe 3 or 4 officers and who had the firearm, and it was a big deal. They were strutting around with their firearms. And eventually when I got to the point where I got my firearm, you realize that it imprints on you, right? It becomes a bit of your identity. You have to go into work, and it doesn't matter. You're on your 4th 12-hour shift of 4. You're tired. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep. Maybe, you had problems at home or your kids were being, kids. You come in and you got to put the firearm on. You put it on, you load up, and you got to say to yourself, am I ready to use this if I have to today? At least I would, right? Because there's a responsibility there. And, for the colleagues who weren't armed, they're looking for you to kind of step up and take leadership role in a situation that may be high risk. So it's something you needed to think about, and it's something that becomes part of your identity. But, the flip side of that is that there were lots of competent officers who weren't armed, right? And when I started in 2008, it was around the time when CBSA became CBSA. It had been CCRA and immigration. There were 2 departments working at the border at that time, and neither of them were armed. So the officers were doing great work. We had expert, immigration officers. We had expert customs officers, especially on the commercial stream. And when CBSA, put the news out that everybody's got to be armed and you can't be armed, it put a lot of fear in the workplace, and it moved a lot of qualified, experienced officers. It moved them out of the workplace, which seems to be the repeat that we're seeing right now.
And as a follow-up to that, Chris, What's been your experience as a branch president with either untooled officers or that accommodation process?
Yeah, that's the interesting question, right? Because this isn't the first time CBSA has tried to get rid of non-tooled officers. And the history, it's a little bit interesting because in 2007, when the arming, 2007, 2008, when the arming initiative had begun, CBSA made it clear if officers couldn't get armed, they would have to leave the workplace, right? They'd have to retire. They'd have to find other jobs. They'd have to seek other opportunities within the federal government. And CIU put in a policy grievance in 2007 about this. And strangely, the CBSA changed their policy and they actually acknowledged the duty to accommodate that, the duty to accommodate needs to be individualized. It needs to be based on individual restrictions, medical restrictions. And that policy grievance made it in front of the Labor Board. And the Labor Board actually said at that point in time, which was 2011, that the policy grievance was moot because CBSA had instituted a policy that actually followed in line with the jurisprudence. We go 3 years later and CBSA again starts talking about, because now in 2014 now, we have maybe 60 or 70% of the officers are now armed. And the people who aren't armed are unlikely to get armed or don't want to be armed or have disabilities to get armed. And CBSA is getting tired of having officers kind of avoiding it, right? So they again put out a letter saying, anybody who can't pass the psychological requirement, anybody who can't pass the CAT 3, the medical examination, you got to find another job. Everybody's got to be armed. And again, so CIU puts in a policy grievance and an unfair labor practice. And that eventually resulted in the CBSA again changing the letter and retracting the letter, threatening employees that they'd have to find other work or medically retire. And I think the next hurdle we find is around 2018. And in this case, CBSA, in my mind anyways, does what they should have done and should be doing. In 2018, 2019, they decide that for officers who have a medical restriction that's impeding them getting armed, that they will find them work within the duties of a BSO and take the arming terms and conditions of employment out of their terms and conditions out of their letter of offer. And they did this. They did this for between 250 and 300 officers, and it worked up until present day, July 2025, when, and I can't speak to the motivations of CBSA, but it's like we went back in time. We went back to the Twilight Zone, and they're again trying to get rid of the officers who don't have the tools.
Let me jump in. The employer is they are known for holding tool status over employees' heads, creating fear of coming forward with any injury, mental health, physical, mental, and they're subjecting themselves over and over. They're punishing people who do come forward, who are honest with integrity. And it says it on our sleeve at work, integrity. We have integrity. We're coming forward with our injuries, mental health, physical. This job isn't the easiest job in the world. We come across various things throughout our daily work. And it's always high frequency of travelers coming through. There's always unknown commodities coming through, and you have to respond accordingly. You always have to be hyper vigilant, and to stay at that day after day after day with no help from your employer, it wears on you. Yes, it is exhausting, very exhausting. That's why I rely on my coworkers. I rely on my LROs to decompress, to talk things over. I really appreciate that Chris has experience as an officer. He knows where I'm coming from, so I can call him anytime. James has expertise as well. Even Amanda, for whatever I need, I call her. Hey, we all help each other. And that's what it's all about. And that's what our employer doesn't understand. They're all vying for the same position. We want to help each other to make everyone better. They want to make themselves better. That's not the same thing.
Actually, could I just jump in on that? When we consider that the employer has tried to remove untooled officers from the workplace twice in the past. This might be their third, possibly fourth time. What we're seeing is that they're forgetting the breadth and scope of the BSO job description, what they do every day. Chris, like you said, there used to be two different departments working in the same building together, customs and immigration, and they made one department, the CBSA, and BSOs were made competent in all streams. That's commercial, that's air, that's marine, that's rail, that's customs and duties, immigration, law enforcement, arrest. The list goes on and on. And the work our BSOs do in keeping this country safe is not limited to primary and secondary. There's an enormous amount of work that goes into identifying threats, hazards, following up, identifying patterns of where traffickers are coming through, where the risks are to Canada. And it's not just wearing a sidearm. It's not being able to exercise use of force to arrest people. It is all the background work that goes into protecting our border that's done without tools in an office, in postal, in targeting. The number of places that a BSO does not have to carry tools far, far outnumbers the places that they do.
So, James, in that context, is the reasonable job offer part of the duty to accommodate? Is it part of the accommodation process, or just something that they handed out to whoever would take it?
No, that's something that you would see at the very end of an accommodation process. But first, you have to attempt to accommodate the person in their job. This is the concentric circle model that is otherwise known as the bullseye approach to accommodation, where you take the individual's limitations and restrictions, compare it with their job description, their functions, their tasks, and then you see if you can remove the barriers, where the point at which the limitations and restrictions meet the functional duties that the employee provides. And if you can remove those, you do. If you need to make physical changes to the workplace, you do. If you can remove that task and replace it with others, you do that before you start looking outside the employee's job into other positions. And this reasonable job offer process is starting with not with the bullseye, but farther out the rings than they should.
And when you look at it from the perspective of arming's been in place now for almost 20 years, it means that CBSA has been accommodating people who couldn't get tooled for 20 years. And now they're saying, can't do it anymore. You got to go. Right?
The last 20 years has obviously have been just fine. What's changing?
What I would expect in any reasonable accommodation process is that the employer, which they're allowed to do, is review accommodated employees, their situation, what their job is. Has there been changes in the workplace that would necessitate potentially modifying the accommodation agreement? I would expect them on an individual basis contact the employee, speak to them. It's their manager that should approach them and ask them for updated medical. They're allowed to do that. They're allowed to have one-on-one customized, individualized meetings with the employee to discuss what the employee is doing and how the accommodation is working, how to make it better if it's not. What this approach has been, the RJO process, has been a template directed from above, from the national headquarters here in Ottawa. They had no intention from the start of looking at our BSOs as individuals. They just saw them as one group of disabled people who could not perform one term and condition of their employment and are therefore no longer welcome in the BSO job class.
Even if the reasons that they can't do that single term and condition are different amongst the population, it doesn't matter. They're just trying to get rid of everyone.
Every single individual I'm aware of that's received notice that they've been affected by the RJO process, I haven't seen a single instance where their contact from their manager was customized, or that their letter of offer was reviewed, that the manager meeting with them was aware of the circumstances of the accommodation, why it was required, what the limitations and restrictions were. There has been no work done by this employer to properly understand who is accommodated, like at the individual level, and how to provide them accommodation in their work. They have simply notified them that their plan is to move them out of their position and into something else, potentially, or potentially retiring them for medical reasons, or terminating them for medical incapacity. Not a single one of these people is either eligible for medical retirement, and they're certainly not incapacitated for medical reasons.
And John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. DTAs should be based on limitations, restrictions, not diagnosis. Also not based on stereotyping. For example, you're a woman member, can't lift 50 pounds. That's a stereotype. There are other stereotypes out there. What I expect CBSA when we're in meetings, there's no delay for process. They need to have interim measures. They need to explore options rather than come up with a final decision. And you can't make a decision quickly, but it needs to be fast enough where it follows the process. You need to, in a sense, put yourself in their shoes and listen to them, talk to them. And we're finding that our employer does not do those things. They don't care, or they appear that they don't care. And that's not good. That doesn't create a workplace where you want to stay. You don't want to retain that position. You want to leave. You want to look elsewhere. Because I see you're an officer, you've been here 15 years, you get hurt on the job or whatever the issue is, you go off for a little bit and you're treated differently when you're trying to come back. I'm proud to put my uniform on. I'm proud to go to my job. I'm proud to perform my duties. But when my employer doesn't have my back and my union can only have my back so far, they can't, provide me another job. So I'm forced to seek outside employment in hopes of a greener pasture somewhere else. And that's why we have a high turnover rate. We're ranked last of all the public sector. And that's one of the reasons. We can't retain, we can't recruit. The only ones getting developed are those in managerial positions. The frontline workers continue to suffer, continue to be overworked, understaffed. And it's an ongoing issue that needs to be rectified. Or you're going to see a mass exodus, and it's already started. People are scrambling, looking for other work.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on something you talked about. What's odd about this RJO process is that normally accommodations happen in the workplace because of something that happens to one of the employees, right? An employee gets injured, or an employee returns to work, or an employee is accommodated, but they're healing, or the job isn't suiting their needs properly. It's really odd that an employer would institute a process that's coming from their corporate, right? There's nothing happening in a lot of these members' current work situations. There's no trigger that needs a change, right? And somehow or other, CBSA has thought that let's do an accommodation process from corporate out into the regions, out to the different work locations, and let's have meetings with employees when there's no problems that are existing at this point in time. So it's something that's unique. I haven't seen that in any other employer in the labor relations world, and I think it's this process, this centralized process, that they're going to trip over their own feet on, because generally, like I say, it's an individual trigger that causes meetings to happen with employees. So there's no possibility that CBSA did their homework on this and noticed that each of these specific 180 employees needs a change to their accommodation, right? There's no chance that all of these, or even a majority of these affected employees, need a change to their accommodation situation. So what's the motivation for CBSA? How would this process come about that corporate labor relations would decide that 180 accommodation reviews be happening? And to me, the only available answer we have so far is that they don't want them in the workplace anymore.
And that's just it. Every one of these 180 affected members has received the Q&A document, which I describe it as the questions that nobody asked and the answers the employer wants you to swallow. It goes straight to the point of, no, we're not going to job bundle anymore, a key feature of accommodations. No, we're not going to change your terms and conditions the way we did back in 2014 after the policy grievance. No, we're not going to respect human rights. We want you out of your job and we're prepared to move you. That's what it says. I think it's necessary to call out how ludicrous this process is. It bears no resemblance to what a proper accommodation process should be. And bearing in mind that the jurisprudence is so clear that there are two very important parts of the DTA. One side is the substantive outcome of a DTA. So this making sure that an accommodation is reasonable, right? And then the second part is the procedural aspect. And that is the question of, how did we get to a reasonable outcome? Following what's been delineated in the case law is that you first approach a DTA. In a unionized workplace, it's a tripartite equation where the union plays a role, the employer plays a role, and the employee themselves plays a role. And we all have to be open-minded, creative in our problem solving, be prepared to think with an idea of, how do we remove the barrier? How do we keep this person who has a disability participating in the workplace in a meaningful way? And with the BSO job description, there's so many different tasks that can be assigned.
How do we change the workplace so that everybody can participate, right? This is how, human rights and equity in the workplace and
the change comes from up top, and we have to get those positions. We have to offer them to those equity groups. You see it all across the country. They're not being filled. Take my port of entry, for example. The equity group that we serve is not represented by the staff, by the management in the region or at the port of entry level. And it's like that all across Canada. Our voices aren't heard. So it's hard to explain to somebody who's in a position of privilege, trying to explain something they don't understand. So you try to go about it in a different way in an attempt to get through to them. And it's exhausting. And I go to James, I go to Chris. You have wording I can use. Maybe they understand better. And in the end, we keep trying.
I feel like that's why it's so important to involve the employee or the member as well, because they're the ones who know exactly how they're doing their job and where their issues are and where the hard points are.
And that's what this employer is not doing. In these first meetings, John, do you want to give your impression of how the superintendent or manager has been performing?
I've called you into this meeting today to talk about
just reading off a script. So in the first meeting with managers, our members have been asked 3 questions. Do you have an updated CV? Will you take language training? And are you open to relocation? Those 3 questions are all they're interested in hearing. They are not looking to understand the members' limitations and restrictions, the work that they're performing in the workplace, the tasks that they've been assigned, the reasons for it. All they want are the answers to those 3 questions, so then they can move on to the next stage in their mind, which is the mapping process, to find them work elsewhere.
So we talked about the effect that will have on the membership. What's next for CIU? Do you have a message for members going through the RJO and DTA process?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about things, and this is something I often say to reps and to members, is the way labor relations goes is that you obey now and you grieve later, right? The interesting thing about this idea is that the union and grievances that have merit were successful in the majority of those cases. It takes time. And, it's hard for members to hear like, hey, yeah, you might, have to move or be affected by this process. But the good news is, and if you go back to what I've been saying about the history of arming and the history of treating officers who had trouble getting tooled, is that we have been successful. And I believe, looking at how the process is being handled, that we will be successful. And I believe we are making inroads at this point in time. And I know that's not the best news for members who are having meetings who are being threatened to lose the job that they hold so dearly, but hang in there and fight the good fight, because you will win in the end.
And you can even say that this is something that the union has fought and won for before, because when you went to the labor board in 2011, it was rendered moot because the CBSA changed their policy just as we wanted. So good luck. John, what about you? Anything to add?
I think our members need to continue to be patient, need to have faith in their union. It's a strong union with a lot of good people in it. We're doing the best we can, and we're going to continue to hold the management accountable for their actions and their inactions and not following certain things, certain procedures, policies. We're going to continue to do our best. We're going to hold on to hope. I'm here because I have hope. I wouldn't be a union steward. I wouldn't be a national human rights rep if I didn't have hope. I'm here because I care. I'm here because I want to be here. I could have easily thrown in the towel, as many of you could have thrown in the towel. But I'm asking you to hold out, to be patient, and have faith in the people behind the scenes that are doing the hard work.
That's great. Thank you. James, any final thoughts?
Absolutely. The RGO process right now is still in the first meeting step. As far as I know, on today's recording date, November 27th, there haven't been a second meeting yet. What we can do, what all the affected members can do, is have a look on the PSAC's website, look up the PSAC's Guide to Accommodation. It's drafted for stewards, but I think it is really accessible to members and what they should expect from a true duty to accommodate process, and start preparing for the second meeting. And that involves getting their file together. That involves having new and updated medical on their limitations and restrictions, and start thinking of creative ways that BSO work can be reassigned or rerouted to them that makes their performance in the workplace commensurate with their BSO job title, the functions and duties that they perform. And we spoke earlier about how broad that scope is. It shouldn't be any challenge to find the enormous amount of work that the CBSA has that can be performed without tools. Where we win in this fight is bringing it down to the individual level and showing the CBSA that this job can be done without tools. It has in the past, and it will into the future. That's where the CIU and our membership will be successful in finding BSO work for BSOs who can no longer be tooled.
And James, real quick, you mentioned policy grievances. Are the members affected by this at the point of grieving yet, or is that something that'll come in the future?
So the CIU filed a policy grievance against this process back in September, and it was recently presented to the ADMO on the 17th of November. No member has been affected yet individually. We're hoping that the policy grievance will be successful in stopping the process where it is right now and not getting to the point where individuals are adversely impacted by this process, meaning that they've been removed from their job or placed in another position. If and when we get to the point where an individual is offered alternative accommodation that's not in their BSO job, that will be the time to grieve. And I recommend that members stay in touch with their steward, with their branch president, and the national office will be communicating out when we get to that stage.
Great. Well, that was a lot of information to take in. I appreciate you guys taking the time to come in and have this podcast. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It's good to be here.
And in a moment of levity to end the podcast, a fun fact for everyone today. What do you think heavy metal and accommodation have in common?
I don't know.
One was caused from the other. Heavy metal as it exists today, that crazy, dark, heavy sound, is actually a result of Tony Iommi losing the tips of his fingers in an industrial accident. Made these plastic thimbles out of stuff that he melted down in his environment and tuned down all of his strings so he didn't have to push as hard with his plastic fingers. And that led to the very heavy, growly sound that we know today as metal music, one of my favorite genres. So we wouldn't be here where we are today in metal if it wasn't for accommodation. Always important. Thanks for tuning in to the new Union Frontier, La Nouvelle Frontière Syndicale. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an update. Got questions or any topics you'd like us to cover? Send them our way. We can be reached at comms@CIU-SDI.ca. I'm Amanda, and we'll catch you on our next episode. Stay informed and restez solidaires.